Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Jonathan Enkel. I'm a professor here at the Marxe School, and I'm chairing this year's annual Public Affairs Week. Welcome, everybody. We have a wonderful program for you this evening. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Everyone, please turn off your cell phones right now. Pull out your cell phone and just turn it off so you're not distracted and so you don't distract us. We have a wonderful panel of three different experts to talk about U.S.-Cuba relations, both the past and the future. We have two academics, Jim Hershberg from George Washington University, who's a Cold War historian, Katrin Hansing, who's here from Baruch, and she looks at more religious and cultural artifacts and issues surrounding the Caribbean and also South Africa, and John Kavulich, who has been for 25 years now the president of the U.S. Cuba Trade Alliance. They'll be moderated by Marx's own Desmond, Arias, a scholar of Latin America and our first Marx professor. We're very, very pleased to have Desmond join our faculty this year. The way we'll run this evening, we'll have sort of a roundtable discussion for about an hour, finish up that around 7, maybe a few minutes after, at which point we'll open it up for questions for about another half hour. So please jot down questions. We hope we're here for you. And our speakers have come, and they're really here to answer your questions and to try to clarify thoughts and ideas surrounding this important issue. We have two mics on either side, and thank you all for coming.
So thank you, Jonathan, for the kind introductions. As Jonathan said, my name is Desmond Arias. I'm the Marx chair here in the Marx School of Public and International Affairs. I don't work on Cuba. I am a Latin Americanist by trade, but being from Miami and being the grandson of a Cuban, it is incredibly rewarding to be here tonight leading a roundtable on U.S.-Cuba relations today. Jonathan covered, I think, all of the critical things. I just wanted to thank first our three presenters for coming here, sharing this evening with us, sharing their knowledge with us. And I also especially wanted to take this opportunity to thank Jonathan for organizing such a wonderful panel and for bringing three such dynamic speakers here to the Marx School of Public Affairs. So, as Jonathan said, we're going to have about an hour of the roundtable talking with itself, and then about a half hour of questions. I'm going to pose questions to the different participants in the roundtable, and then we will after that, move into a set of audience questions. I wanted to start out asking Professor Hershberg if he could reflect on the current moment in U.S.-Cuba relations and how it fits within the wider context of U.S.-Cuban relations and Cuban history over the past century.
Okay, thanks very much. First of all, I want to say hello, and thanks to Jonathan for giving a New Yorker in exile down in Washington an excuse to come back to the homeland, as it were. The title of this session I see is Embers of the Cold War. I'm the ember on the panel. I'm fading but still glowing. I'm the historian. And I'm in the middle of a book project that actually focuses on the period and U.S.-Cuban relations around the time of Fidel Castro's revolution. Not only his, that's a matter that's still ardently disputed, and the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It actually started with my interest in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's what I'm prepared especially to talk endlessly about, because the last quarter century or so has seen an absolute revolution in understanding Cuba in the Cold War due to the end of the Cold War and the opening of communist archives. And so when we come to the question period, if anyone is curious about what's new in understanding the missile crisis, the Bay of Pigs, U.S. reaction to the revolution, were there missed opportunities to avoid the half-century plus estrangement between Washington and Havana, I'm glad to talk about that. But in terms of the current moment, which was, after all, the question, it's a fascinating moment in that finally, after 55 years of rigidity in U.S.-Cuban relations since actually the Eisenhower administrations in its last days in office in January 1961 cut relations with Castro's Cuba, and you had 55 years of economic embargo, diplomatic isolation, attempts at strangulation, not to mention covert operations. You had this breakthrough between Obama and Raul Castro a few years ago, the opening of diplomatic relations, or reopening of diplomatic relations, increased direct trade and travel and tourism connections, and the beginning of what was hoped to be a much broader relationship. Obviously, the election of Trump has curbed a lot of that, but not entirely, because he's beholden to the ardently hardline elements of the Cuban emigre voting population in Florida, especially South Florida, but he has not completely reversed Obama's opening. And the context that I would raise is the following. Obama wanted to escape from the straitjacket of U.S. domestic politics. I mean, clearly the only reason the U.S. refused to recognize Cuba, have normal relations with Cuba, was U.S. domestic politics, not out of any practical realities about international relations or a direct threat. The U.S. had relations with the Soviet Union, with the People's Republic of China, but it was simply not necessary to have direct relations and politically inconvenient, both for Democrats and Republicans. Obama was willing to conduct an experiment, which I saw play out. I'm happy to see most of you are a lot younger than me, so relatively few of you saw this play out, at the end of the Cold War. I actually was backpacking around Europe after college and things like that, and could see that the U.S. won the Cold War, to the extent that it won the Cold War, mostly through soft power. It wasn't trillions of dollars of military expenditures. It was rock and roll, blue jeans, cultural influences that eventually caused the communist collapse. And Obama was willing to try seeing if flooding Cuba with tourism, ideas, and American soft power could be more effective than an economic embargo and political isolation. We may yet get to see this play out, combined with the inevitability of generational change as the Castros and their immediate acolytes die off. But it'll be very interesting to see, and of course the great hope is that change is peaceful and gradual and not traumatic and violent. I don't want to eat up the entire panel, so let me pass things along.
So I wanted to ask Professor Hansing a question that actually Carla Robbins articulated for me when I spoke to her earlier. Carla is the director of the Masters in National Affairs program here at the Marxe School. Cuba is in a really interesting moment, right, in the sense that it's undergoing one of the first major leadership successions in a very long time. With Diaz-Canel becoming the head of state of Cuba, right? This will be the first time that you don't have a Castro leading the country in almost 60 years. But will Raul continue to rule, right? How much is the transition that's happening a transition where power is really going to be passed to a new generation, and to what extent will the old generation, and Raul Castro in particular, retain power in the Cuban political system?
Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you for the invitation. So I speak tonight as a social anthropologist, and my views on Cuba are based on about 20 years of research on the island and in the diaspora, and so I have much more of sort of a grassroots perspective. And so some of my answers tonight will be more grounded in sort of what I hear people say and what my research shows me from working on Cuba. But with regards to your question on transition, political transition. So first of all, I would actually say it's more of a succession, not so much of a transition that's about to occur in April, when Raul Castro apparently will step down, and Miguel Díaz-Canel is supposedly going to be his heir. Now, we don't know if that's really going to happen yet, but that is what has been said, and I think that succession is a succession because we're going to see sort of a younger version of the same thing. Nothing else really will change. Yes, it will be the first non-Castro in that leadership role, but Miguel Díaz-Canel is somebody who's been vetted. He's been part of the power structure for a long time. And we may see some changes in the future because, yes, he is now, I think, 57 and not a product of that historic generation. He was born in the revolution, is a product of it, didn't make it, and that's important psychologically. But I think most Cubans on the island expect sort of more of the same. And I say this because I think the revolutionary government also wants to send that message in terms of stability, everything's in control, there will not be a big shakeup or anything like that. There will be a younger person in that leadership role, but Raul Castro is not going anywhere. He will still stay the leader of the party, of the Communist Party, which is de facto a much more powerful position. So I think, and you know, he is quite old. I think he's 86 now or 85, around there. So, I mean, he will not be around for that much longer, but I think, you know, we can't just think Raul Castro is about to leave on the 19th of April and that's it. He will still be, I think, controlling the political strings in the background, definitely, for a little bit longer.
And I wanted to ask John Kavulich if he could talk a bit about how this succession might affect U.S.-Cuba relations.
The most difficult question that the current Cuban government, previous Cuban government, and the next Cuban government is going to have to answer is how do they define success? That's the absolute key to understanding Cuba, because the revolution was all about equality, and it was all about taking from those who were perceived to have too much, distributing it out, equaling the playing field. But during the last 25 years, there have been moments where the government, generally because it finds that it doesn't have a lot of other opportunities, has allowed a re-immersion into the economic structures of what we would call private enterprise. But in each case, when there are visible signs where some Cubans are acquiring wealth, the government will then come in and apply tactics, whether it's fees or taxes or restrictions, and try to level the playing field again. And we're seeing that now. The U.S. business community, for the last 25 years, has sought engagement in a variety of ways. And it's been a painful ride. It truly has, because of these peaks and valleys. And it's not only the height of the peak and the depth of the valley, but it's the distance between each peak. And U.S. companies have generally wanted to re-engage because they were there and they understand the marketplace. But using the last 2 years as a guide, or using December 17th of 2014, President Obama makes an announcement. And the good news was the Obama administration, during the period from January of 15 through the election of 16, made some good decisions that impacted what U.S. companies could do. And the Cubans made some decisions that impacted positively what U.S. companies could do. But there was a problem. The Obama administration was so focused on the optics, so excited about what they had done, that they failed to grasp some of the details, some of the fundamentals that the business community needed in order to expand the number of companies, the type of companies, the constituency in the United States that would have an interest toward Cuba. On the Cuban side, they failed miserably at embracing and allowing much of what the Obama administration permitted. So therefore, what we had is neither the Obama administration nor the Cuban government ever planned for one reality that the business community did plan for. And that was a victory not by Hillary Clinton. And that was a catastrophic mistake, because the Cuban government looked at what the Obama administration was doing and said, hey, we'll make some changes. U.S. companies will engage. We'll use the interest by U.S. companies as bait to get the interest of companies in other countries that don't have any restrictions. We will use this period to renegotiate foreign debt because governments feel, because of what Obama did, because of the likelihood Hillary Clinton's going to win, that this is going to continue. So the Cuban government's going to be able to use all this, and they did, masterfully. But the Cuban government looked at 2016 and said, we're going to slow this down because Clinton will win. The Clinton administration will want the Obama administration during the transition to do as much as possible, do all the dirty stuff, get all the little stuff out of the way, so that she is inaugurated on January 20th of 17, and she's got a clear ride to then begin the normalization process. But of course, what happened? Donald Trump wins. And then added to that, the nightmare. Fidel Castro dies in November. So what happens? Cuba gets put onto the front pages, and every single individual that's auditioning for a job in the Trump administration throughout the country gets on the bandwagon. Castro's dead, get tough on Cuba. The U.S. business community, we run because there's no upside. And the tragedy of this for the U.S. business community is, I'll just throw some numbers at you. There are 229 global markets for U.S. food and agricultural products. Anyone have an idea of where Cuba ranks? 55th of 229. They've ranked as low as 29. And this is a country last year we sold $260 million worth of food and ag products to on a cash basis. In the last 17 years, Cuba's bought $5.6 billion worth of food and ag products on a cash basis from U.S. companies. $24 million worth of healthcare products. Not a lot there. But it's a significant marketplace. Rapid forward, where we are today, there are 8 U.S. companies that have a physical presence in Cuba. 8. 4 of them are airlines with ticket offices. 2 of them are travel agencies that focus on Cuba. One is Caterpillar of Illinois with a distribution center, and the other is John Deere, Illinois, with a distribution center. 8. There were over 200 that had requested to open offices in Cuba, and the Cubans said no. So that's sort of where we are in this my little world anyway. It's been a tragedy to watch, the Obama administration not do what it should have, watch the Cuban government not do what it should have, and the U.S. business community is now looking, and we're suffering from that because if the Obama administration and the Cuban government had done more, Donald Trump would have not been able to do what he's done.
Did you want to follow up?
One brief follow-up for John. In this grim picture, which is very grim, could you at least comment, though, you mentioned 6 out of the 8 companies that do have a toehold, if not a foothold, are 4 airlines and 2 travel agencies. What, though, has happened to tourism and the number of Americans who have been able to visit Cuba? Because, again, in terms of the idea that peaceful contacts and soft power, even if you don't have free internet, free media, can have an effect. Has the Trump break also put a brake on tourism, or has that grown as much as expected?
Well, first of all, I need to admonish you because there is no tourism. Remember, U.S. visitors to Cuba are not tourists. The T word we don't want to use. That potentially can get you into a lot of trouble legally. Has nothing to do with Trump or Marco Rubio or anybody else. There's the law, the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000 specifically carved out tourism as a prohibited category. So, but there are 12 categories that you can go under. During the last 2 years of the Obama administration, U.S. visitors to Cuba increased triple digits. Last year, I think it was about 1.2 million. About 600,000 of those people of, I think, of Cuban descent, which is normally the largest number.
Is that only direct travel or including through third countries?
No, because one of the initiatives for the Obama administration was the reauthorization, the reestablishment of direct airline flights. And that started started to get together in 16. Yeah, it was in the fourth quarter of 2016. So really only had a year. The cruise lines then got in as well. Now the travel related has done very well. And with the Trump administration, even with the changes in regulations that commenced in November of last year, the numbers are down probably 10 to 20%, which is a lot less than everyone feared. But they haven't taken a tremendous hit, primarily because the narrative about what President Trump, which is, here I'm going off the rails, which is often the case with President Trump, the narrative of how it was projected about what he did wasn't the reality in terms of what he did. For example, with my constituency, he made one particular change, removing opportunities with companies controlled by the Cuban military. Now, that wasn't a big deal. Even though the Cuban government is moving more of its economy to being controlled by the Cuban military, U.S. companies really didn't have any engagement. But in addition to that, optically, no CEO wants to sit on CNBC or CNN or even Fox and say, oh yeah, I want to do business with a military company. So it wasn't that impactful. But the visitors to Cuba have been disruptive. And it reminded me, back before most of you were born, I think, with when Mikhail Gorbachev was head of the USSR and Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister of Great Britain. She once made a comment that Gorbachev smiles, but he's got steel teeth. And what Obama did was incredibly disruptive to the Cuban social fabric. The most important outgrowth of what he did was to spearhead the development of access to social media and access to internet, cell phones, etc. The Cuban government had been desperately trying to slow walk it all because they realized what happens with that. When Obama went to Havana, and he talked about that in the speech, and that they were livid. But that is a great legacy of the re-engagement. The number of people going has put money into Cuba. Cuba is now a $2 billion marketplace for U.S. travel-related entities. So that, even in this constricted environment, there are opportunities that people are engaging, but the internet, social media, cell phone stuff, the Cubans curse Obama every day for that.
Thanks.
So I wanted to change gears a little bit. So one of the more, and ask James a question. One of the more spectacular aspects of the last year has, of course, been the health problems at the U.S. Embassy, the sonic attacks. I was wondering if you could, in the context of the embers of the Cold War, and hopefully not a coming firestorm of a Cold War, I live far too close to the Pentagon for that. If you could, talk, contextualize sort of these sort of sonic attacks, the tensions around that, in the context of the broader history of U.S.-Cuban relations since the revolution.
Well, of course, U.S. diplomats, were gone from Cuba effectively from January 1961 until the Carter administration. And under the Carter administration, there was an effort to normalize. And actually, this is all part of the hidden history that began to surface after the Cold War ended, both due to the communist declassification, but also declassification of U.S. Army. Henry Kissinger almost normalized relations with Fidel Castro in 1975. There were very intense, interesting negotiations. That fell apart again for reasons that are disputed. But under Carter, at least a U.S. interest section re-engaged. And I don't think you had anything comparable to the sonic disruptions, both in terms of the health effects in terms of seeing, direct health effects, but also the mystery. I mean, there were incidents, people were always followed, people were sometimes suborned, sometimes were recruited, and there have been tensions with Cuban intersection, on 16th Avenue, not quite near the Pentagon. But as relations worsened, there was a sense that, hey, we're in hostile territory. But that's not so different from, U.S. embassies in Moscow. There's no embassy in Pyongyang, but, in places that the U.S. didn't get along with. I think this is rather different than the kind of harassment. Now, of course, in the closing days of the U.S. embassy in 1960, when the U.S. was already plotting what would become the Bay of Pigs invasion, but there was still an operational embassy, there were numbers of incidents of harassment and things like that. This one has people, I think, a little bit befuddled because it's not clearly in Cuba's interest, Cuba's own interest, to do this kind of thing. And they, of course, have denied responsibility, have suggested jointly investigating it. And I suspect, that there are certainly some hardliners in South Florida and probably populating some areas of the Trump administration who say it's all their fault. But I think there are a lot of experts, in and out of government who, are still keeping an open mind. I mean, there's no question this is not something that was made up. I mean, this had serious physiological impacts on the people who were affected. But I don't think there's a clear culprit yet. And I don't think that this is a continuation of the past. This seems a little bit out there, frankly.
And I wanted to move back to Professor Hansing. And I wanted to sort of pick up on a thread that John raised at the very end of what he was saying. He said that the Cuban government was very upset with the Obama administration working to bring the internet media into Cuba. And I was wondering if you could reflect on the nature of the internet and online sociality in Cuba and the effects that it's having on civil society in Cuba.
Sure. Well, thank you for that question. So Cuba is one of these still odd places that when you travel there, you will not automatically get your cell phone to work and to have a Wi-Fi connection. What you need to do is buy a card, one of those cards you still rub out the numbers, and then try to get a connection on some public square or some public space which is connected to the Wi-Fi, or in usually a tourist hotel. And this is very limited, usually to urban spaces, particularly the capital, but some other provincial capitals. And so I always like to point out that even though, yes, there is much more internet access now, a lot more young people trying to get online, it's still a largely urban phenomenon. And it's also mainly happening among young to middle-aged people who have the money to do so, because it's very expensive to get online for Cubans on a sort of an average Cuban salary. You could call it a luxury. So you won't see all Cubans hanging out on these public squares where you can get online. On the contrary, it's still a minority of people. However, Cubans are known for their incredible creativity, given the fact that they've lived in an economy of scarcity for so long. Cubans have learned to make do with what they have and to figure out loopholes in any situation, including this whole issue around communication. So even though the internet is not available to most Cubans, what does happen, which is, I think, fascinating, is how Cubans have figured out how to share information. So usually what happens is that the people who have access to the internet, they also have a lot of flash drives, or before it used to also be floppy disks and things like that. But they basically download lots of information and then share it with people who they're friends with their family, and they then share it with others, etc. So there's an enormous amount of sharing of information from the web going on. So much so that there is this phenomenon called el paquete, which is translated as a package, which is a very, very lucrative business in Cuba, which is basically this, maybe you can help me explain it because it's a little complicated, but basically it's a bunch of young Cubans got together a couple of years ago and figured out that there is this huge market in Cuba, which is basically information and particularly entertainment, because a Cuban state television isn't that interesting to most Cubans. And so they, through contacts in different ministries, particularly people who work in the internet, in the Cuban state internet, were able to start downloading loads and loads of shows, television shows, movies, talk shows, sports events, et cetera, et cetera. And so every week now on a Wednesday in Havana, you can buy for 25 convertible pesos, which is about a little more than $25, a whole tetrabyte of information that you could never watch in probably even a month. And people do that. They buy either the whole package or part of the package, and then they watch talk shows from Miami or telenovelas from Brazil or sports events around the world. But what's also happening is that these same, and it's all passed around on either hard drives or portable drives or flash drives, there's an intra-provincial system now. So bus drivers now have a second job on the side, which is to bring these flash drives from province to province. And so basically the whole island is being informed about what's going on in the world, in entertainment, in news, in sports, in everything, via El Paquete.
Do people watch the paquete communally?
Sometimes.
Because individuals, that's expensive, $25.
Yes, so people share it. So, the further away you are from the Wednesday it comes onto the market, the cheaper it gets. So every day, if you buy it the next day or the next day, it gets a little cheaper, and you can also just buy certain portions of it. Like if you're just a telenovela addict, you can just buy that part or the sports. But people also buy it communally, like whole families, and then share it. Some people share it with their neighbors. So yeah, it definitely is a very shared commodity. But it's something that many, I would say even most Cubans now have direct or indirect access to through sharing. And I think that is how most people are getting their information, actually.
I was wondering, to follow up on that, if I could ask you, if you could reflect a bit more on the role of Cuban civil society in the political system.
Sure. Well, I'm always hesitant to talk about Cuban civil society in the way we talk about it or envision it here or in any democracy. Cuba is a country that is still very controlled by a one-party state, and most Cuban citizens do not have the freedom to organize around, any interest or hobby or religion or anything like that. And that obviously is a problem for civil society. So even though Cuba is changing enormously, and it has been since, I would say, actually the fall of the Soviet Union, which engendered this massive amount of economic need and crisis on the island, and people started to have to start thinking more independently and for themselves. Organizing together collectively is still very difficult. However, having said that, there are certain people, certain groups, certain even maybe professions where some of that is going on very slowly. Sort of, I would include the independent journalists there, or bloggers, filmmakers and artists in general, who sort of dare to speak up in a certain way through their art. But in general, Cuban society is not yet able to organize. But what is going on, which is interesting and has been for a long time, is that there's an enormous amount of frustration on the island, particularly among Cuban youth, particularly people who've been born after the end of the Soviet Union, people who kind of really were born into and socialized in a time of economic need and scarcity, and who didn't live the golden years of the revolution. Those people are very frustrated. They don't believe in the revolution. They don't believe in what the government says, because they've really never lived that ideal of equality, etc. And so that frustration is actually growing, and I think right now, again, after this moment of opening towards the U.S., also an opening of the Cuban economy, not quite at the same time as the opening with the U.S., but over the last 8 years, the Cuban economy has been slowly opening towards more private business opportunity. And this has given Cubans, particularly again young Cubans, this hope that perhaps their future can be in Cuba. This is starting to change again. People are getting more frustrated, more disgruntled, and again are thinking more about leaving the island, which is kind of a common theme in Cuba in general, but more again now, particularly given the fact that the economy is closing again in Cuba. U.S.-Cuban relations are, again, very, very difficult. And so Cubans, young Cubans in particular, are looking for opportunities elsewhere, anywhere. The U.S. obviously is more difficult to get to now, given the change in U.S. policy towards Cuba. But there are other countries. Uruguay is now the big destination. Cubans really want to go to Uruguay, Chile, places like that.
I wanted to come back to you, John, and ask what you see in the coming years as the most critical issues facing the Cuban economy and where you see it evolving.
If I may too, if I say something that's just appalling, please do interrupt. For Cuba, the last 5 years, they've seen their major benefactor, Venezuela, become less so. And that's not changing. It's just been this gradual disintegration across the board, whether it's discounted oil or being a source of revenue by sending Cuban nationals to work in Cuba, giving the Venezuelan military advice or counsel, and that just it's being extinguished. That, along with commercial relationships with countries in the continent of Africa, have changed. No more are there countries who look at Cuba and say, we need this to stay the way it is, this anachronism. We need it to be there at any cost because it annoys the shit out of the United States. And we'll pay for that. China, Russia, Venezuela, Iran, basically, whether it's George Bush's axis of evil or whatever you want to call it, but basically any government that isn't really happy with us. And that somewhat includes countries that we do consider to be friendly with, who politically want to show domestic politics that they're not totally in bed with the United States. So there's all this activity that goes to allow Cuba to stay the way it is, not because Cuba can afford to do so, but because other people pay for it. Now there are fewer people willing to pay for it. Cuba's done some smart things in the last 2 years, took advantage of the Obama administration openings, renegotiated Paris Club, $9 billion down to about $1 billion something, renegotiate with others. But now what happens? They've had 3 years where they've gotten shellacked by the weather. Nothing to do with them, but they got hit hard. And they've had issues with crop prices not being where they need to be, production of those crops for export not being where they need to be. And that's, much of those issues are issues of their making. But for the government, they need to decide what it is that they want for their people. One of my first visits to Cuba, back when there was an interest section, sitting with a senior diplomat, and he said to me, John, if you want to understand Cuba, and this was while Fidel Castro was in power, he said, this is Fidel Castro talking to you. I'm willing to let my people suffer. Are you willing to let my people suffer? It's a really profound statement, but if you look at the relationship between the U.S. and Cuba the last 60 years, it makes a lot of sense. The Cuban government is going to have to readjust, as it continues to do, the definition of the revolution. And the revolution was all about, we have this revolution, we even out the playing field, and everyone is happy. No one needs anything more to eat because the government provides it. Education, government provides it. Healthcare, government provides it. Jobs, government provides it. But most importantly, you don't have any expectations that are unmet because the government is providing everything. Almost there's no ambition. The government's providing everything. And that's what they have to eat away at. And it's challenging. It gets easier because people are dying off. There's just, the further we get away from 1959 with that generation, the easier it is. The flip side is the easier it is in the United States too, in South Florida. The more of that generation that die off, generally the children who were born here or left when they were very young, they're respective of their parents and their grandparents. If the grandparents had property taken, had friends or relatives killed, whatever, they generally are respectful of those until they pass. So there's a lot of just timetable that's working this out. But the Cuban government's, as I said earlier, their number one decision is how are they going to define success? And the number two decision is how much are they going to trust their people and allow them to make mistakes? Because that's one of the most critical aspects of the control that government has. It's we don't trust our people to make mistakes because we think primarily that the overwhelming influence of the United States, 2 million people of Cuban descent, primarily in South Florida and northern New Jersey, will influence our people, meaning the island people, or the archipelago people. And we have to protect them from those shiny objects, the cell phones and the rest of it. Now, ironically, the rapid increase of cell phones and all that stuff has brought more money into Cuba because it's increased the connectivity. But I think it's those two things. It's defining success and how much you're going to trust our people to make mistakes.
I have a question for the two of you to try to link up the history with your deep knowledge of the current situation. And this is very future-oriented and having to do with the generational change. And obviously it's going to be an interesting test if it's even more apparent after Raul resigns, even if he's still the power behind the throne. Obviously, the Castro years saw massive celebrations of the mythology of the revolution. Walk around Havana, you see gigantic pictures of Che Guevara, you see the Granma yacht, all of the anniversaries of the revolution. And the legitimacy of the current government still depends on respect for the revolution and its defiance of the Yankees. There were always cynics, of course, about that, but they were generally in a minority. To what extent is this younger generation no longer responsive to that mythology? And to what extent will the prospective leaders, even if they are still of the Fidel and Raul mold in terms of basic belief in the policies, to what extent do they need to sort of change the mythology to retain at least some legitimacy? And obviously these are questions not so different from faced in North Korea, the PRC, where things have changed drastically, but it's still the same regime as in the old days. To what extent do you see that shift happening in Cuba, and to what extent do you think it is beginning to affect the leadership level?
Well, I would strongly argue that it all comes down to generation, and I think that people who were born and grew up before the revolution and benefited from the revolution, who are now 75 and over, many of those still are very revolutionary. But everybody below that, I would say, is not even so cynical. I mean, I think people are frustrated and are not only hoping and waiting for change, they are ready for change, particularly young people, particularly those people who were born, after 1985, who grew up in a completely different Cuba, in a country where you see poverty, where the school is still free and healthcare is free, but it doesn't work very well anymore, where people who are pediatric neurosurgeons have to, drive a car at night to make extra cash to feed their family. So this is not the Cuba of the revolution, and it hasn't been for a long time, actually. And that is the reality. It is also a Cuba now that is highly transnational. Not just the cell phones and the limited internet, but we just heard a number, 600,000, maybe even more Cuban Americans travel to Cuba every year. They only go for one reason, which is family. They go to see their family and to bring stuff to their family, whether it's money or material remittances. They also send over $2.6 billion a year to Cuba in remittances. There is a strong tie between the island and the diaspora, not just in Miami and South Florida, but globally speaking. And with that comes information, comes dreams and fantasies about life elsewhere, about consumption, etc. Young Cubans are no different than young people in most places, which is they dream of consuming stuff. And I would argue maybe they're even ironically more materialistic because they've not been able to consume for so long. And so there's a real generational gap and discrepancy. And you can see it also between the government and the majority of the population. I would argue strongly that the government is very out of touch with what's going on in society. And because people don't have the freedom to really express themselves, although there's more nuance in all of this, obviously, people do keep up a certain status quo in terms of paying lip service to the party line. But that is also because we're talking about a country which is highly controlled. This is an authoritarian state, not like in North Korea, no, nowhere near North Korea. But if you dare to say what you think and it's critical against the government, that will have consequences. So people are careful, and that's very understandable. And so people still think of leaving before starting a demonstration in the streets. And this psychology is important to understand why there is no more rapid change in Cuba, because the state security system does a very good job. It's probably one of the best functioning things in Cuba.
The young entrepreneurs in Cuba have shown a resilience that I'll use seasoned people like me who've been around, remain impressed with. There are two guys that I know that run a hair salon, and they do mostly guys, but in 2016 they expanded, and into 2017 where they added a spa. And they get their training, they get thumb drives from Paul Mitchell, the hair products company. And I mean, some of the hair stuff they do is wild, but these guys, I've watched them from when they began with this concept they were going to open it, and I said to them, "You're mad. There's so many issues." And they said, no, we're just going to try. So they start and they find a building that is out of the way. so it doesn't draw a lot of attention. But they get it, they lease it and that, build up their business, get their cash flow going, and they go online, they find Excel spreadsheets, and they do all this stuff. In 2017, they did their expansion, and even with the election of Donald Trump and the imposition of restrictions made it difficult, but they're not giving up. And one of the reasons is that when Fidel was alive, there used to be this joke that you would never hear people talk about when Fidel died. It was if he died. And then, as years went on, it began to when he died. So he dies. And this, these young people, that some of them are doing just some amazing types of businesses that they've developed, they're tired, they're exhausted. But just like entrepreneurs in the United States that face different types of barriers, they do feel that time is on their side as opposed to on the status quo side, on the historical side, that the pendulum, that they know that the combined ages of the three top officials of the Cuban Communist Party approaches 300. And they know that the timetable is on their side, that that's going to end just because of chronology. So they're not giving up. They're tired. They build into their business models these 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 forward, 2 back, and they get all of that. At some point, look, when the transition and the succession is completed in Cuba, there are going to be some amazing business school studies of how these folks persevered. But I would say that there isn't a risk of a lot of these people running away, waiting for, Raul is, Vice President Canal is going to take over on actually 29 days from today. But Raul Castro is going to remain First Secretary of the Communist Party, which under the Constitution guides the country. So he's still going to be in charge, and basically head of the military. So as long as Raul's breathing, Cuba's only going to go a certain distance, and getting to that point is going to go at a very slow pace. They need, Fidel died. They need Raul to die. And I say, if there is anyone here from Cuban government, I'm not saying that disrespectfully. I'm saying that it would be the same as if we had some of our founding fathers still, if George Washington was still hanging around Mount Vernon, watching CNN all day to see what President Trump was doing. You need sometimes the personalities to move on so that the country can move on. And that's why, Vice President Canal is going to be it's very steady, but he's going to have a little more difficult time because he doesn't have the marquee name. When Fidel said to the USSR, the Russian Federation, or China, I need help from the gringo, from the Yankee, imperialists. Okay. When Raul says it, maybe they'll get back to him the next day. Now, those phone calls may not get returned.
So you've given us some insights into the frustrations young Americans may have felt during the second Madison administration. Or, excuse me, yeah, Madison, exactly. It's after 7 o'clock, so we have a little bit less than a half an hour for questions. And I was wondering if we could take some questions. It would be great if we could maybe take sets of 3 questions at the microphone, and we'll give the panel an opportunity to respond, and then we'll move on to subsequent rounds of questions, depending on how much time we have.
As you do, how many of you have been to Cuba? All right, and now, this is going to be bold of me. How many of you went within all the regs? You know, meaning that you did so within the Treasury Department regulations, so you were there, quote, legally, unquote. Okay, so about 30% of you or so. All right.
If they could state their name and then their question.
Okay.
Oh, I thought you were going to ask a question.
No, on the travel to Cuba front, I'll ask you what I ask my students. This is just for the students. How many of you students own yachts or real estate?
In
Relatively
Cuba?
small. Because
Cuba?
No, the reason I ask is because at least when I got to Cuba the first time, I snuck there. And back then it was a big deal that 30 to 60,000 Americans, this was in the mid-90s, snuck to Cuba. And the way I did it is I called a travel agency in Nassau, the Bahamas, flew to Nassau, and then was set up 2 days to go to Havana and back. The Cubans had it set up. They didn't stamp your passport. They would just stamp a piece of paper, so there's no evidence you had gone there. And technically, it was not illegal for Americans to go to Cuba. It still is not. It's only illegal for Americans to spend money in Cuba. This is without a license of the kind John meant. But it was never worth prosecuting you if you didn't have some assets you could seize. So even though 60,000 plus Americans would go over here, no one would ever actually get prosecuted. So I tell all my students, especially who take courses on the history of the Cold War, you want to experience the Cold War, you've got two choices. You could go to Pyongyang or Panmunjom, Korea, or you can go to Cuba. And the food's better, the beaches are better, the drinks are better, the music's better. And I tell my students,
It's not as far.
what are you doing for spring break? Go to the Bay of Pigs. You know, I was there for a conference, seeing Fidel Castro walking on the Playa Girón Beach, with people who had tried to assassinate him 40 years earlier.
It's okay
It was
to go
just
to the Bay
surreal.
of Pigs. Don't wear your bathing suit. Just because you're not supposed to be there as tourists.
But if you sneak in via Jamaica, via the Bahamas, via Toronto, via Canada, via Mexico, wear your bathing suit all you want.
Well,
But I tell my students, frankly, to cover yourself, here's a reading list. Take notes. You're doing research. That's one of the categories you can get a license for. Now, under Obama, you didn't need to document in advance. I think Trump reimposed that. Is that correct?
no, you have to document.
Yeah, now you need to document it.
Hopefully, one of the reasons why you had so many hands up
Yes.
in the room is because since the 1980s, when Chancellor Murphy was the Chancellor of City University of New York, and Frank Bonilla, Professor Frank Bonilla, was the Director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, CUNY has had one of the few licenses from the Department of the Treasury to send faculty and students and to receive.
But only
faculty
as
and-
groups or can individually?
all sorts of ways. I mean, things have changed since then, but what I'm trying to bring up is that there's a long history of this very city, University of New York, playing an important role in being a center for the transmission of ideas and faculty, and we've received many faculty from the University of Havana for periods up to 6 months, and they've been among us, and sometimes students don't even know who they're interacting with. So the university has played a role, and that was going to be my kind of first comment. There are programs at Queens College and at City College where students to this day can go legally to Cuba in study missions. So where there are other opportunities to go through Cancun or Bahamas or Dominican Republic, there are also many ways to go legally through the study programs, and I encourage all of those of you who are interested to avail themselves. And by the way, I'm Hector Cordero, I teach in the faculty here. I wanted to also make a very quick comment that I think we need to be careful not to over homogenize or over generalize on the Cuban youth as the old are revolutionaries and the young are not. I mean, I think there's a lot of differences in the young generation, both here and there. You can see in the generation here, even though they may be, say, politically to the right, that when you talk about Cuba, especially the younger ones that don't necessarily have the personal losses that maybe their grandparents had, there's a little bit of a hidden sense of pride in talking about Cuba and in really understanding the historical role that the island and its people have played when you think about the Caribbean imaginary, right, and challenging U.S. hegemony in the Caribbean, which is also part of the reason why the U.S.-Cuba relation is about more than the U.S.-Cuba relation. It's about Cuban influence throughout the rest of the Caribbean and Latin America, and the challenges that the U.S. sees in in that kind of counter-hegemonic position that Cuba has taken. But I wanted to ask you a kind of a little bit of a geekier question to take advantage of the fact that you're all here. And I understand that the biggest challenge the new president is going to face, or maybe the old president will do him the favor of facing it before he passes power, is the issue of the dual currencies currently in Cuba. And I think it's fairly well known that something has to change or something has to happen with that. And I think it's also fairly well known the dangers of overly telegraphing the when and the how you're going to do that for reasons of people hoarding merchandise, inflation. I don't think you want to welcome a new president, especially given everything you said about the historical nature of this transition, with that kind of a non-gift. So can I ask you to speculate a little bit and talk a little bit about what you see as prospects, medium, short, I'm not talking long term, short, medium term, for how Cuba can kind of realign itself in the current time. And again, thanks for coming and sharing your knowledge with us. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Cuba has two currencies. There is the official Cuban peso, so 1-to-1 with the U.S. dollar. And then there's the the Cuban peso, which about 25, they peg at about 25-to-1. And Cuban workers working for government entities generally earn the Cuban pesos, so 1/25 of the regular. A taxi driver, for example, might earn 10 convertible pesos. So, in essence, looking at 250 regular pesos.
Half a salary.
So for businesses, when foreign businesses come into Cuba, companies generally have to go through the Cuban government to hire the workers. And if we're saying, okay, this worker's worth $500 a month, or let's say this worker's worth $1,000 a month, the Cuban government will take $1,000, but give the equivalent in Cuban pesos to the worker. So for the company, it's an immense tax, and it's a huge windfall for the Cuban government. No country does well with two currencies. The Cuban government has said that they are planning, perhaps as early as this year, to begin that process. There is no way to accomplish it without people being hurt. It just doesn't work. So the question the Cuban government is trying to grapple with is, how much pain do we feel as the government that the people will absorb without rising up against us? And unfortunately, the best time to do that is when all is looking good with the economy, because then you've got some elasticity. The Cuban economy has near no elasticity, so whatever it does is going to impact hard. But in order for they to move to those next levels, where you ask about what the government needed to do, that's essential. I think that they may go with that timetable this year because Canal's the perfect person to come after Raul. Bland, no one knows who he is. He doesn't have a physical appearance that's threatening. And he's 57, so he's a relative spring chicken. Ironically, look at the ages of the three leaders of the Democrat Party in the United States House of Representatives, who were all in their 80s. So this guy, Pence, Vice President Pence and Canal are the same age. So I think Canal may be able to use a little bit of reservoir of uncertain goodwill, that if they were going to do it and if there was going to be pain, now's the time to do it, because Raul's still alive, so he can say, no, he's not, do it, give him cover. So I think that they may do it, but it is going to be ugly. Their credit line, of course, are those remittances. And the Cuban government will start saying, get your relatives to start sending more money. One little anecdote on that. When Obama started the initiatives and the Cuban government started to expand the social media and the internet. A friend of mine has family in Cuba, and he would go down and he'd bring things. And he said that he said, I used my cousins and nieces and nephews say, if you've got an old cell phone, bring that or whatever. He said, then they started to say, no, we want an iPhone 6, or an iPhone 7. So it not only began with, now they wanted capabilities, they wanted brand status. Well, I'll get a Samsung. No. They would email, no, we need the iPhone. So there's some interesting things happening. But that's what I think is going to happen on the currency.
Could I just add to that? I used to live in Cuba, and I remember already in around 2000 and even before that, this whole issue of the currency reform was already an issue. And so even though this year it's really supposed to happen, it was really supposed to happen 18 years ago. But what's different now is that there was actually apparently a run on the banks last week. People were actually standing in line at a lot of banks in Havana in particular trying to change their money. So whatever's going on, people are also getting nervous and reacting, and in order to not lose too much money.
I also have a follow-up question for John and Katrin. Obviously, the remittances are crucial to the economy, but in a number of comparable, obviously Cuba's unique, so a key part of political economic evolution has been when emigres who left for political reasons started returning and contributing, whether in Lebanon or in China from Taiwan. Is it still considered too risky, or is there under consideration any effort to try to lure Cuban Americans back to actually contribute to the economy? And also, as far as the currency, I remember when I first visited China after college, it was a dual currency, or FEC, foreign exchange currency. And it created a lot of resentment. Same thing with hard currency in the Soviet Union and Eastern Central Europe right after the Soviet collapse and the collapse. But there is a history towards transitioning through dual currencies.
Sure.
And you wonder if there aren't some lessons by now that could be learned. But is there any effort to lure back Cuban Americans, or are they so afraid of the infection that they could spread in terms of politics?
What I've found over 2.5 decades is most officials in the Cuban government look at most Cuban Americans who are successful and who have not re-engaged politically as a plague to be prevented from re-entering Cuba at all costs.
Are they still gusanos?
It's interesting. During the final 2 years of the Obama administration, some Cuban Americans who were incredibly hostile to the Cuban government were given visas and allowed to go back, and they've been going back and forth. But generally, their homes are gone, their lands are gone, they have claims, but they have so many resources that we just don't need to go there. But we wanted to go and see home. We just wanted to see people, even if we didn't have family or if we did. And the Cuban government's been pretty tolerant of that. But there are still, the Cuban government has some mechanisms where people of Cuban descent from outside the country can provide funds and do things, but they're very, very skittish because of the resources that could just come down and hammer them. So I think they tend to would rather have them use Western Union than come and deliver it themselves.
But if I may, the reality is such that there's a lot of money entering, we could call them remittances, but I would actually call them investments, from family in the diaspora to family on the island, particularly now also because over the last couple of years, the Cuban government has allowed Cubans who are residents in Cuba to buy private property. And this has really made the real estate market in Cuba very hot. Most Cubans don't have the money to buy homes. And so what's happening is that family abroad is putting up the capital often to buy an apartment, a home, which is then done up for a bed and breakfast or a private restaurant or a salon or whatever in the private sector. Other people are also, Cuban Americans are asking their cousins or nephews or whoever on the island to buy something so that they can have something on the island. So there's actually a lot going on. We don't know exactly in terms of numbers, but it's not going through Western Union.
Yeah, no, that's true.
And there's a whole money market going on between South Florida and Cuba. On that note, and this is something that I've been working on for a few years now, as a result of this situation, but the fact that remittances is so important to the Cuban economy, as I said before, officially it's $2.6 billion, but probably it's more because so much money comes in indirectly. Most of that money is coming, and this has to do with the interesting fact that most Cubans who've left the island still today have been white Cubans. And yet today, probably, we don't know exactly, but probably at least half, if not maybe over half of the population in Cuba is not white. And so there is this interesting dynamic where the remittances that are flowing to the island are mainly coming from white exile families or immigrant families to white families on the island. And so you see this particularly in the private sector. If you go to most private restaurants in Havana or elsewhere, or bed and breakfast, or hairdressers, or nail salons, or whatever people can do in Cuba in the private sector, most of the people who own those businesses, and often people who are staffed, or waitresses, etc., are white Cubans. And this is very problematic, because what's happening is that we're seeing that there is a very rapidly increasing racial inequality growing in Cuba, partly through this dynamic of remittances. And it's something that is very unfortunate and is not the fault of the diaspora or the Cuban government. But what is lacking, and maybe you can say something to this, is the fact that the Cuban government hasn't yet offered its citizens a real credit system where people can get a loan to open their business and do so without the help from their cousins in Miami. If you want to open a business in Cuba today, your best bet is to get a loan from your cousin in Miami. And so this is where all these dynamics come into play, and it's causing, unfortunately, a new Cuba where there are haves and have-nots, and there's a racial composition to that.
I wanted to make sure we got the other questions here on the floor. If you could just tell us your name.
Sure. My name is Lauren, and you actually just touched on one of the things that I was going to ask. The other thing, I guess, is just maybe speculating on things that America can take now that we are talking more frequently, and you talked about all these new documents that have opened up from Cuba, things that they've been doing right that maybe America hasn't been doing right. For example, I know that the healthcare system isn't great there, but maybe there are aspects of it that we should be looking towards, or education, or what have you. Maybe something uplifting that we could take.
Well, let's see. Most of the documents, alas, are not coming from Cuba itself, although even there is almost analogous to what John was saying. It used to be that the only hope to have documents declassified that were formerly secret in Cuba was for Fidel personally to snap his fingers. I'll never forget, there was a famous conference on the Cuban Missile Crisis in Havana in 1992, actually, right after the Soviet Union ended. And some visiting organizers of the conference were trying to convince Fidel Castro to declassify Cuban documents on the Cuban Missile Crisis because the Soviet documents were being opened and the Americans had really. And finally, Fidel Castro just huffed and puffed and exploded. What is this you keep saying about declassifying history? Is that taking the class struggle out of history? I will not hear it. And secrecy is pervasive. However, And I've been part now of several conferences where the condition of the foreign organizers, whether it was on the 40th anniversary of the Bay of Pigs or the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we will only spend the vast amounts to organize this conference and bring people back if you release your side of the story. It's in your interest. But this has been a painstaking process, and only literally in the last couple of years, for example, has it begun to shift. Literally, the situation has been, if you wanted to get the Cuban side of the historical story that you wanted to tell, you had to essentially become simpatico, or suck up to, in the vernacular, the people who ran that bureaucracy, or ran that archive, and become personal friends. You know, the best example is a professor down in Washington who's written some fantastic books named Piero Glahesis, who's done the best books about Cuba in Africa, in Angola, in the struggle for the Cold War in Africa. And he got amazing access because they trusted him. He sucked up, but he had integrity. He said, you want me to tell this story? I can't tell it without your documents. And then he made them available. And you can now read records of meetings between Castro and Soviet officials, things like that. It's a fantastic contribution. But, and I went through this process with Soviet archives, Polish archives, Czech archives, Vietnamese archives. It's been a very grinding process to convince them that it's in their own interest to have Cuba's side of the story told from Cuban documents and not the documents of their enemy. And so you're beginning to see a process, for example, in the Cuban Foreign Ministry, where you can actually request documents. They're mostly junk, but at least it's a beginning to try to get the Cuban side. And they're ahead of North Korea, which doesn't say much. They're behind, obviously, all of the former Warsaw Pact, but the beginning of the story from the Cuban side of the Cold War is beginning to emerge, and it's absolutely fascinating because contrary to what many American officials often claimed, it's very clear that Fidel Castro and Havana were not Soviet puppets. They had their own agenda, and so their story is not simply saluting what Moscow told them to do. They had their own agenda, and that story has been beginning to emerge in recent years, but it has a long way to go.
If you could tell us your name.
Sure, not you know it already. I'm Christian, and I'm studying in the MIA program. I'm not sure if you touched on it, I came in a couple minutes late, but if the U.S. policy were to shift on remittances, I think I recall seeing a couple of tweets from our commander-in-chief touching on this subject. But if remittances from U.S. citizens were to be suddenly a focus of foreign policy, especially towards Latin America and especially Cuba, what impact could that have economically, not just for Cuba, but for the rest of the other countries that are so heavily dependent upon it, and how destabilizing could it be?
I can focus on the Cuba, but as far as other countries, I mean, if the U.S. government were to restrict remittances to other countries?
Well, we can keep it to Cuba, yeah, but, you know.
Oh, but just coming
but
in.
it does, to follow, I guess, if it was a broad policy to target remittances, but if any Cuban aspect to that as well, you know what I mean, like a general policy to tighten up on remittances.
Well, I think that, it's happened before under other administrations. Remittances has always been a thing that has been, used as a way to control the other side. I remember under Bush, there was a cap at $250 a quarter or something like 300.
a quarter.
And that, those were very different times in Cuba, economically speaking. People, had a lot less to live on. Those people who had family members abroad. So yeah, it would have a huge impact, huge. We can't even remember those times anymore. Remittances is such a part of daily life in Cuba. And even though I just said that it is producing a lot of inequality in general and racial inequality in particular, remittances are positive because money is circulating in the Cuban economy. And it's creating businesses, et cetera, et cetera. So, it would have a huge impact, negatively speaking.
Yeah, I don't think it's much of spend a lot of time thinking about it because President Trump, he gave his speech in June, and that excited him. He got some testosterone out of that. And so that generally was his moment. We went June, the regulations weren't promulgated until November. One of the reasons for that, was because the business community did everything that it possibly could to explain how what they wanted to do might be impactful and hit the wrong targets. And remittances were talked about at one point. That was sort of the big one. We really heard them. But in the end, it isn't a place that the administration wanted to go. And primarily because, here's sort of the ironics that is Cuba. Marco Rubio, the senator, junior senator from Florida, who wants to be president and wants to run again, well, in order to do that, he can't lose a Senate race in his own state. And he still needs the support of the business community throughout the U.S. So he has to be somewhat careful in terms of having distance between what he's saying about what he wants to do with Cuba and what he actually makes happen. There needs to be distance for him because he needs the money from people in the private sector. So we know it. He knows it. He knows we know it. We know he knows that we know it. So it's there isn't that much more that I think is going to happen out of the Trump administration. But the young lady was asking about some uplifting things. How many of you drink coffee? Okay. Well,
Legally.
Illegal coffee. Go to an espresso store, and you'll be able to find Cuban coffee in those little capsules. And that was courtesy of the Obama administration. Same thing, you can go online to, I think it's called Fogo de Cuba. It's a charcoal company. And they import charcoal from Cuba. And they're in Florida, and you can order it online. So, there are, and I just sort of throw that out, there were some things that the Obama administration allowed to happen. Unfortunately, the U.S. business community wanted some more things to happen. The Cubans didn't allow it, but there is activity. And Nespresso, that was a very big deal. That was Nestle sort of giving its seal of approval for something. And the coffee, they've now gone through 2 rounds, and they've sold out both rounds.
But as John explained to me, Bacardi has made sure you still can't buy Havana Club here. So your
This
mojitos
is
cannot be
true.
fully Cuban.
And I can attest to the quality.
I'm sorry, yeah? I know. Well, Mayor de Blasio would be absolutely thrilled if you could learn how to organize a rally like they do in Cuba. I think you'd have 500,000 people out there. He'd be happy with that.
Involuntary organization.
Yeah, I mean, it's not easily flippant. It's easy for us to say they're required to do so. And if they don't, there are consequences. That's all true. A friend of mine I used to ask him, and I said, why are you always going to these party meetings at your workplace? I said, I know you don't like going to them. And he goes, no one likes going to them. I said, well, then why are they always 100%? And he said, because the last person in the room always has to run the meetings, and no one wants to be that person. With Cuba, they are a very proud people. There's a lot of pride at all ages. And so when they have these big rallies, whether it's May Day or the outpouring for Fidel dying, or the inauguration of Canal, there are people that they may not have a reference point before the revolution. They may have been born like right at the revolution or so young that they didn't have a childhood that predated it or an adulthood. And they look at Cuba, and they look at how Cuba has always been outsized historically. I mean, it's always taken a place that's far exceeded its rightful place. And there's some pride in that. And when the government says, you know, we've had to sacrifice this in order to do that. And in the United States, we've generally, throughout the last 59 years, have given them pretty much of an open toolbox from which to pull out. They did this, they're doing that, you know, and it makes it fairly easy. But also, many Cubans today are living the same way they did 60 years ago, especially out in the country. So, you know, when you see 100,000 or 500,000 people, and they're all in their Che T-shirts or Revolution Cheek T-shirts, whatever, it's not all a Potemkin thing. You know, it's not that all, you know, they give their number, they get their T-shirt, they go, and then they give the T-shirt back, and they go back to work. There's a lot of believing in what in the ideals of what Fidel professed, and it's hard to. You can analyze someone's ideals, but it's hard to, you know, and you shouldn't, you know, go after them in that. You can try to redirect and all that, but it's. I urge all of you know, if you can go. You know, sometimes people that are going now, you know, they go to Cuba and they basically want to see an amusement park of decay. They want to go and see buildings that have crumbled or buildings that are about to crumble, or the Che signs, and they want to see it before it all becomes Disneyfied or San Juanified or that, and the buildings get repaired and painted, and that, you know, and that's all fine. But I would urge, as you were talking about, get out of Havana. Go to Santiago de Cuba, second largest city, which is mostly Afro-Cuban. And Cuba does have its, I think it's a simmer, I don't know if it's a bubble, but it's a simmer. They have a race problem. The government is almost all white Spanish Cubans. Havana, mostly white Spanish. The money coming into mostly white Spanish. It's a problem they're going to have to deal with. I don't know how they're going to deal with it. But yeah, it's a fascinating place.
So it is now 7:38, so I think we should wrap things up. I wanted to thank the three of you for speaking, and thank everybody for coming, and hope you have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.